Okay, I'll start again. So good morning and welcome to this opening event of AfAm Week Spring 2022. My name is John Keene and I chair the Department of African American and African Studies at Rutgers University-Newark. For those unfamiliar with AfAm Week, the African American and African Studies Department held our inaugural AfAm Week in the fall of 2019 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the department, which was a direct outgrowth of the vision articulated by the brave Black Rutgers-Newark students involved in the Conklin Hall Liberation in 1969, an event that transformed Rutgers-Newark and the wider university. This spring's AfAm Week includes a full lineup, which you can find at, so I'll put this up, visual aid, sasn.rutgers.edu/AfAmWeek, all one word. It includes amazing events every day this week, including this Wednesday, March 23rd, which is Rutgers Giving Day. So I hope you will support the department's goal of supporting our, hope you will support the department's goal of supporting experiential learning for our students via the Giving Day portal. And please let others know about Giving Day via social media. And you can follow us on, and it's at RUN AfAm, all one, on Twitter, and I think Instagram, right? And the hashtag RUN AfAm Week. Okay. Some other events will include a Conklin Hall Gallery Walk on Tuesday, a conversation on Wednesday on why study African American Studies, featuring Executive Vice Chancellor and Associate Professor of Sociology Sherry Ann Butterfield and Professor Lacey Hunter, who is here with us today. Yes. Thursday and Friday afternoon dialogues with 5 different panel discussions on dialogue in the time of fracture, focusing on the 75th anniversary of Rutgers-Newark's designation as a public institution of higher education, and featuring our Rutgers-Newark Chancellor Nancy Cantor, Newark Mayor Raz Baraka, among many others. James, are you participating on that? Yes, and Professor James Jones, who's here with us today. And Friday evening, closing out our events, Dr. Zain Abdullah, who will be speaking on Malcolm X, Islam, and the Souls of Black Folk. So again, you can find all of that information at sasn.rutgers.edu/AfAm Week. So now I'll offer a brief introduction for our speaker, Professor Charles Payne, who will be speaking on Deadbeats on the State, Fighting for the Right to Vote in the Deep South. I want to begin by noting how incredibly lucky we are to have Professor Payne here at Rutgers-Newark. Professor Payne is the Henry Rutgers Distinguished Professor of African American Studies and serves as Director of the Joseph Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Research at Rutgers-Newark. He is one of the preeminent scholars in his field. I should say fields, make that plural, because there are many. His research focuses on urban education and school reform, social inequality, social change and transformation, and modern African American history, particularly the civil rights movement and Black freedom struggle. His numerous books, I'll name just a few, include So Much Reform, So Little Change, a co-edited anthology, Teach Freedom, the African American Tradition for Education for Liberation, Getting What We Asked For, The Ambiguity of Success and Failure in Urban Education, and I've Got the Light of Freedom, The Organizing Tradition in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, which is, I think, the book that introduced me to Professor Payne's work. It's an amazing book, and it received awards from the Southern Regional Council, Choice Magazine, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Human Rights in North America. His honors, which are also numerous, include a senior scholar grant from the Spencer Foundation and a resident fellowship at the Foundation for 2006-2007, an Alphonse Fletcher Fellowship in recognition of work that contributes to improving race relations in American society and furthers the broad social goals of the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education decision, and a fellowship at the very prestigious Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Professor Payne has been a member of the board of the Chicago Algebra Project, of the Steering Committee for the Consortium on Chicago School Research, the board of directors of MDRC, the Research Advisory Committee for the Chicago Annenberg Project, the editorial boards of Catalyst, the Sociology of Education, and an educational researcher, and the advisory board for Teacher College Press's series on social justice. I'll add that he is a co-founder of the Duke Curriculum Project, which involves university faculty in the professional development of public school teachers, and also co-founder of the John Hope Franklin Scholars, which tries to better prepare high school youngsters for college. He also served briefly as interim chief education officer for Chicago Public Schools, which I just find absolutely amazing. And there is so much more that I could say, but in the interest of time, I will simply present to you Professor Charles Payne.
Oh, thank you very much, John. Okay, it's my pleasure. Now, where's Christina? How do I go to the slides? I can move these, all right. There we go. And that'll work. And if we can go to full screen, that'll work. Thank you. And to advance. There we go. Afternoon, or still good morning for another 5 minutes. Quick brag that's relevant for this group. There's a good possibility that I'm the first person in this country to have an undergraduate degree that said African American Studies. My BA in African American, it's actually Afro-American Studies. That was a different era. Is from Syracuse in 1969. The first formal black studies programs were formed in 69, right? There was a quirky thing at Syracuse that let you write your own major. And so I got through on that. So I can't be sure, but nobody can disprove it either. Right? So I figure it's true until somebody calls me on it. And everybody can hear me speaking through the mask like this reasonably well. Let's see how long I can last before I expire from the heat. And the other thing to say is to be honestly, this is, for those of you who aren't graduating this year, it's an advertisement for my course, because I haven't been able to teach since I got here. I think my life is sufficiently well organized that I can teach next spring. So what I'm doing today is a snippet from the course from the Civil Rights Movement that I hope to be teaching in the spring, and I hope I intrigue you. I hope I intrigue some of you into taking it. So, background. Obviously, one of the signature achievements of American social struggle is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In Mississippi alone, black voter turnout went from 6% in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It went up to 59% in 1969. In just that 5-year period of time, right? It's a qualitative change in the capacity of African Americans in the Deep South, which is where we have been for most of our time in this country, right? It's a qualitative change in their capacity to participate in the political process with all the limitations of that, right? So I'm going to say the last 20, 25 years, and James could elaborate on this more deeply than I, right? We've seen persistent erosion of the Voting Rights Act through gerrymandering, more difficult registration procedures, restrictions on early voting, absentee voting, purging of registration rolls, limiting polling places, and the list goes on and on and on. And what's been interesting is how aggressive this movement of voter suppression has become over time. It used to be chipping away at little things, and now it's just pushing very, 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 very hard. And I am in contact, especially with members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the only youth-led civil rights movement of national civil rights movement of the 1960s. And many of them just literally feel like the work to which they gave much of their lives, the work to which they gave their youth, is being destroyed. It's being washed away by the current political trends. So anyway, this just seems to me to be a very appropriate moment to take a step back and think about what that movement was like, right? And I am going to try to give you a very quick outline of the fight for the right to vote in the Deep South from 45 to about 65. And one of the things that I subtext to the talk. Okay. Protest is not the same thing as social action, right? There is a sense in which the whole talk is about the theft of history, if, to be real clear. But that what has been happened to some degree is that the history of the movement has been Hollywoodized. It has been reduced to its most dramatic expressions. So the movement becomes really great speeches and stirring speeches and big demonstrations, right? The idea that there are people who decide that this is a multi-generational study, I'm going to do everything I can all of my life, and I'm going to prepare another generation to struggle, right? The people who are devoting literally decades of their lives to this, and they think of it not only as what they do, but what their families do, that is lost, right? So anyway, that's the subtext. No more commercials for at least 5 minutes. So talk about the 20-year fight for the right to vote. And I'm going to frame it mostly around two families, one from Mississippi, one from Florida, two couples really, who were involved across many, many years. So I'm going to make at least 2 points, although I'm going to say 3 points. One, the movement begins, the modern civil rights movement begins much sooner than most people think it does, right? The idea that it began in Montgomery or that it began with the 54th Supreme Court's decision simply, it's just not a sustainable position, right? Two, that you have to understand as the sine qua non of this movement, the essential element is the willingness of what we would call ordinary people to make absolutely extraordinary sacrifices, right? And three, women are central to this process, right? In fact, let me read you this right now in case we get rushed for time. From Andy Young from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There was women going door to door, speaking with their neighbors, meeting and voter registration classes together, organizing through their churches that gave the vital momentum and energy to the movement that made it a mass movement. Right, so that's Andy Young, and he's absolutely right. But to begin with, in some ways, the interesting decade is the decade, what did I do with that thing? Is a decade of the 1940s, right? Two things happen. If you were to ask, in the 20th century, what percentage of blacks in the South could vote? Well, not actually, were registered to vote, because the registering and being able to vote are different things, right? If you ask what percentage of blacks in the South are registered to vote, at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, it's 3%. 1910, 3%. 1920, 3%. 1930, 3%. 1940, 3%. 1947, 12%. 1950, 20%, right? The change, right? The break with the past, the definitive, and then it can get pushed back down in the 50s, right? But that first boom, right? From the 1890s, if you consider that's a decade of disenfranchisement, right? After Union troops have been withdrawn from the South, and the South reasserts, comes as close to reasserting slavery as it possibly can. From 1890 to 1940, right? The sort of complete, effectively complete disenfranchisement of the South begins to end in the 1940s. Why? Two things, and I'm going to mess this up. 1944, the Supreme Court, in a decision that is Smith versus all right. I always want to say all white because what the decision did was say that the all-white primary, the idea that political parties were private and that they could determine who could and could not vote in their primaries, it said that's illegal. You can't do that. Everybody can vote in the primaries, right? Because in the old days, if you won the primary in the South, that's all. The election didn't matter. It was all over after the primaries. So that's 1944. 1945, something else happens, right? Black troops who fought in World War II start coming home, right? And they come home with attitudes, right? They come home thinking, hey, you know, I paid my dues, wherever. So Medgar Evers landed on the beaches at Normandy, fought across France, came back to Kosciuszko, Mississippi. First 1946 election, the first election after he got home, he and his buddies put on their uniforms, right? They had been discharged from the service. They put on their uniforms, and they had a private march down to the polls, right? They got there, and there were armed white men waiting for them to prevent them from voting. They went home to get their guns, right? Somebody stopped them from coming back, otherwise it would have been a confrontation that would not have gone well. But it's the symbolism of that moment, right? saying, this is what I fought for, and I'm going to have it, right? That's Medgar Evers. This next gentleman, a good friend and close colleague of Medgar in the movement, Amzie Moore, Sergeant Moore, served in the Evers came back as a sergeant too. I think it's interesting that they showed a kind of potential for leadership in that context, right? Before they came back and led in another context. So Amzie Moore, it is going to be Amzie Moore in 1960, who says to the SNCC kids when they're running all across the South, doing direct action and sitting in at lunch counters and libraries, Amzie going to say, man, in Mississippi, it's not about sit-ins and demonstrations. It's about the right to vote, right? So we want you to come to Mississippi, but not to do demonstrations. We want you to come to Mississippi and build political organizations that will ensure us the right to vote. So he defines in that sense. He's going to define in that sense the movement that's going to emerge in the 1960s. But this is what he would have looked like in the 1940s, and in the early 1950s. This is just a, oh darn, I thought I had a bit better shot. Sorry about this. I thought I'd expanded this. This is Mound Bayou, Mississippi, the all-black town in Mississippi. This is a tent meeting for the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, of which he was, I think, vice president at this time. 53, remember, right? He is the man in white, in a white suit, and that thing in his hand is a voter registration form, right? And at this meeting, he's just given a speech about we all need to get registered, and look at the folk crowding around him to get registration forms. That's 1953, right? And so, again, largely, not entirely, but largely under the leadership of veterans like Medgar Evers and Amzie Moore, African Americans in the South began mobilizing in, let's say, mid-1950s through the early what did I say? I should have said they began mobilizing around the right to vote in the mid-1940s, in the late 40s and early 50s. There was not a lot of repressive violence for a period of 7 or 8 years. And there's an immediate response among black populations who want to vote, right? That's very clear. So what's going to bring all of that? What's going to bring all of that to an end? Brown versus Board, 1954. Right? Once Brown v. Board comes down, then the white supremacists who've been pretty much complacent. We're in power, we're not threatened. Few more folks voting doesn't mean a whole lot to us. Once Brown v. Board comes down, white supremacy mobilizes against any threat, and the threat of voter registration in much of the South, especially in the black belt counties, may have been the most profound kind of threat to white supremacy. So what that meant, you wanted to be an activist then and there, admit you were going to be fired from your job. If you had crops, no one would buy them. If you were sick, no doctor would see you. If you needed insurance, no one would sell it to you. If you had a mortgage, the bank was going to try to foreclose. And if none of that worked, you could just be burned out or shot out, simply murdered. 1955, one of the clans, there are always multiple clans in Mississippi. There are usually multiple clans in Mississippi. Couldn't get along with each other. But one of the clans put out a death list at the beginning of 1955 with 8 names on it. By the end of that year, 5 of them had been either killed, shot, or driven out of the state. One of the 3 that was relatively untouched was Medgar Evers, right? He would be killed 8 years later. But that says something about when those lists circulated, right? Just the chilling effect that it had. People knew that this is not a joke, right? They're going to get at least some of the folk on this list every year. And so when you think, I'm so glad that the Emmett Till murder is getting so much more publicity in recent years, but it's not a thing in and of itself. It's not separate from what's going on, right? It's August of 55. It's coming in the midst of a Southwide war on black people that is reminiscent of what would have happened 30 or 40 years ago in its vigor, right? And its robustness. And Emmett Till is a part of that larger wave of terror. All right, I think. I am going to talk Now, about two families. This is, give me a second. This is Ronald and Ellie Damer, residents, lifelong residents, both of them, of southern Mississippi, the area around Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Mr. Damer had only had a 10th grade education, and 10th grade education in Mississippi in 1950, but not much, right? I suspect most black schools at that time were open 4 or 5 months a year because they wanted black folk in the fields the rest of the year. And footnote, a forgotten piece of history. In effect, foreign languages and algebra were both banned in black schools. That is, they would not support them. And therefore, when black youth got a chance to demand their own curriculum, they demanded algebra and foreign languages, right? It's just a long forgotten piece of history that I think is important. So that's Mr. And Mrs. Damer. He had a 10th grade education. She was a school teacher. She'd gone to college. He was doing pretty well for himself, right? Had a grocery store. A picture of the store. Grocery store, sawmill, planing mill, cotton farm, right? All of his industries, he employed both blacks and whites. And everybody, so far as we know, black and white, considered him to be a fair, even-handed employer. I think that's significant to how the story ends. With all of those businesses, he was still supervisor of both the choir and the Sunday school at his church, Shady Grove Baptist Church. Sounds so southern. In Hattiesburg, 30% of the population was black. Only 12, not 12%, 12, right? Only 12 people in the county were registered to vote in 1960. Mr. Damer himself first attempted to register to vote as part of that late 1940s wave. He first attempted to register to vote in 1949. He was refused. In fact, he would never vote in his entire life. He was refused, whereupon he sued the sheriff. This is, here's my next story. Harry Moore did the same thing in Florida, right? These are completely ridiculous lawsuits, right? You can't possibly win a lawsuit against the law, right? In Mississippi, but yet they did it, right? It's this insistence, you will recognize me as a citizen. You will recognize me as a citizen. And they're going to keep hammering until somebody recognizes them as a citizen. So there's a kind of magnificent defiance, right? In this, I'm going to act like I'm a citizen, whether the state of Mississippi recognizes that or not. So anyway, there's something powerful in his insistence. Anyway, there was no chance he was ever going to win, right? And instead, what happened, the sheriff busted into an NAACP meeting. They were mad because he was the president of the NAACP, and they commandeered the membership list and made it very difficult for people to be a member for a long time. When adults were too intimidated, let's say, that's fair. When adults were afraid to join the NAACP, where do you turn? Right, you turn to young people, right? And so he and Medgar Evers, right, who has now become, I think it was 53 or 54 that Medgar Evers became the field secretary of the first field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP. It is, again, it's just a completely sublime act. Everybody and his mother, including his wife, said you're signing your death warrant, right? They're not going to let you be a full-time NAACP agitator in the state of Mississippi. Nonetheless, Medgar was not a person to back down once he had made a decision. You talk about one hard-headed man. That was a hard-headed man. Anyhow, Medgar Evers and Ronald Damer started organizing NAACP youth chapters all across the state. Right? Now, those youth chapters brought a lot of young people into civic action, into a certain kind of mode. And then, when the 60s come around and the level of activism goes up a level, those youth chapters provide much of the foot soldiers and the leaders, right, for the activism that's going to take place in Mississippi in 1960. So when that happens, when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, invited by Amsley Moore, comes to Mississippi and they come to Hattiesburg, Mr. and Mrs. Dahmer essentially financed the movement. They were then going door to door canvassing. The Damers, introduced the SNCC workers to their list of activist friends. They loaned them cars, they fed them, they gave them a place to stay. So their home became the movement center in Hattiesburg and remained the movement center, and everybody knew it, right? Everybody remained the movement center for easily a decade, I would think. And that meant they got threatened all the time, right? They were not undercover. I studied Greenwood, Mississippi. And Greenwood in the 1950s, only one or two people let it be known publicly that they were members of the NAACP, and all mail from the national office was sent to those two people, and then they redistributed it to the membership. That says something about how dangerous it was just to be known as an NAACP member in Mississippi in those days. So obviously they're out in the open, they're exposed, and they're threatened all the time. For years, he and Ellie took turns guarding the house, sitting up all night in shifts with guns. And then one of these quirky things, Mississippi Southern kinds of things, right? Yeah, that's close enough. Anytime somebody knocked on the door and it wasn't expected, Ellie went to the door because both of them believed that the Klan wouldn't shoot a woman. That's an interesting to believe to risk your life on, right? And yeah, again, they grew up with the folk in the Klan, right? It's not that like they didn't know them, right? They knew they could have told. Medgar Evers, on that march, when he tried to get to vote, he knew all of the people in that crowd because they all played baseball together when they were kids, right? So they knew these folk and did not believe they were going to shoot a woman. I just find that interesting and dubious from my perspective. 1965, August, the Voting Rights Act passes. January 1966, with the first post-voting rights election coming up, Dahmer goes on the radio and he says, if you are afraid to pay your poll tax, I think at the time you had to have 2 years worth of poll tax receipts in order to vote, right? He goes on the radio and he says, if you're afraid to pay your poll taxes, once you go downtown and you pay your poll tax, that's intimidating too. That puts your name on the list. You could come to his store, give him the money, and he would go and pay the poll tax for you. But if you did not have the money to pay your own poll tax, you could tell him that, and he would still pay your poll tax for you. So he goes on the radio and he gives this address, right? The next day, which would have been January 10, or that day, which would have been January 10. What am I saying, right? Yeah, it was the night of the address. And this is something I don't understand either. They didn't put a guard on, there was no guard on the house that night. And I don't know if that's because after the Voting Rights Act was passed, they relaxed. There was more federal presence in the South, so it's possible that they did that. I've never seen an explanation, right? But we know they kept that house guarded for years, right? But when the thing came to its final climax, they did not have a guard on the house. So like 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 carloads of the White Knights of Mississippi firebombed the house. They shotgunned the house and his store, which was right next door. Their 10-year-old daughter was very, very badly burned. Mr. Dahmer had burns over 40% of his body. Let me see if I have that picture. So, yes, I do. So that's the house. Now, irony of irony, right? They had 6 sons. I'm sorry, they had 7 sons. Of the 7, 6 of them served in the armed forces. Together, they served in the armed forces 80 years, right? That's the kind of family they were, right? So this is the house, right? It is bombed out. That's the basement you're looking at. There is no house there. The only thing that seems to be standing from this angle is like the fireplace, the chimney, right? So these boys have to come home in uniform, right? To bury the parents, right? To bury the parents, to put the parents away. And they know their parents had a reputation all over the county for treating everybody right, right? So all you can do is ask yourself, put yourself in their place and try to think about what you want. So, this, I don't think I have the hospital shot. From the hospital, again, 40% of his body burned. His lungs were scorched. His face was disfigured. He urged Black people to get out and vote. One of his favorite statements was this one. His motto, right? This is how people remembered him. If you don't vote, you don't count. And in the hospital, he gave an interview in which he said, I've been active in trying to get people to register to vote. People who don't vote are deadbeats on the state. Deadbeats on the state. I figure a man needs to do his own thinking. What happened to us last night can happen to anyone, Black or white, right? And he died shortly thereafter. But, and I'm sorry I didn't say this before, his wife and daughter lived, and they probably would not have had he not taken them out of the house through the windows in the back. Then he went back into that house that was on fire, and he returned fire against the Klansmen from his front door, right? So that meant he got exposed to the fire not one time, but twice. And everybody figures it was that second time going back into the house. But because he went back into the house, his family was able to get away. His elderly aunt, his badly burned daughter, and his and Ellie, right? So let's see. Sam Bowers, he was the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and 25 years after this, 25 years after it happened, the cold case, he was convicted for having ordered the attack. And I think he spent 6 or 7 years in jail before he died, right? But it was 25 years after, right, before they could get the conviction. Mrs. Damer, I'm sure some of you know what sorority that is. That stuff is beyond me. Not that long. Years later, Mrs. Damer was interviewed, and she said, the only way I can look at Vernon's death and not cry about it is when I walk in the bank, I see Black faces working there. You see buses driving, you see buses driving, you see Black faces sitting all over them. You see the police force, you see Black faces on the police force. You go out to the University of Mississippi and see all of these children, white and Black, out there at the university. And then you look at his death and say, well, his dying did all this. Then it's worth it, and he would have done it again. Right? So that's from Mrs. Damer, right? And I don't know if you'd call this irony or not, but 1992, she was elected to the election commission for the county, and she served there 10 years, right? And the other sort of interesting and contradiction to, I'm going to say, stereotypes we have about how the South worked. The obviously all white Chamber of Commerce rebuilt the house, right? And the truth was, Mrs. Damer and the Damer family had enough money to rebuild their own home. She let them do it because she thought it was an important statement to make it clear that not every white person in Mississippi was crazy, right? But they did that. The family did not rebuild the house. the White Chamber of Commerce paid for all of it, as far as I know. I know they paid for a lot of it, supplied the lumber and the timber and all of that stuff. So that's the story of the Damers, right? And partly what strikes me, I mean, the courage thing, you can hardly not see that, right? But as is true with so many of these folks, what actually strikes me, one, they didn't think, Ruby Hurley, who was the first Black professional civil rights worker in the South, said almost none of these people thought of themselves as courageous. That's just not, that just wasn't a part of how they thought of themselves as doing what was necessary, right? This whole notion that I'm courageous or I'm a hero or this is some big thing, that's just not, wasn't much of a part of their makeup. But I am struck by how many of them taught Sunday school, started little leagues, right? Took kids on trips. Vernon Damer was famous for taking adolescents from all around the Gettysburg area to political meetings all around the state where they met different kinds of people and encountered different kinds of ideas. Some of you might know Joyce Ladner, the sociologist. She's maybe one of the most famous of them. But there's a whole cadre of folk who would say the Damers laid hands on them, right? That they had an agenda about youth development that's actually broader than the civil rights movement, right? But certainly it's broader than this particular moment, right? They're going to raise another generation to struggle. One more, I think. One more family. This is Harriet and Harry T. Moore. Both of them are school teachers until they both get fired, right? For their activism. They're from Central Florida. Harry Moore is just a study in contradictions, shall we say. On the one hand, he is a painfully shy man. I don't know if he ever gave a public speech, right? And yet he was the president not only of a local NAACP, he was the president of the state branches at a time when it was arguably the most successful state branch in the South, right? Under his leadership, they registered 100,000 people in Florida, and actually 100,000 Black folk, more than any other state in the South in the 1940s, right? Enough that they could then become a kind of swing vote in close elections across the state, right? He was a power, but he would not give a speech, right? He was too shy. So he wrote his speeches, and his teenage daughters would go to the conventions, and he'd sit there and they would read his speech for him, right? So that's one side of his personality. On the other side of his personality, he is absolutely fearless, right? He starts organizing NAACP chapters in the late 1930s, let alone the 1940s. He organizes at least 17 chapters across the state of Florida. He attacks the unequal pay given to Black and white teachers. Again, he files a suit, I think it's 1937, against unequal pay for teachers. They protest lynchings, they protest job ceilings, and the overall unequal educational resources. Until she got fired, Mrs. Moore refused to use the textbooks that came from the state, which of course, were racist. So she threw them out and gave kids books she bought herself so that she could teach Black history in Central Florida in the 1940s. Of course, both of them got fired from their teaching jobs. And something like 70 years later, Brevard County restored their jobs long after they were gone. 1951, the sheriff in a town called Groveland, Mississippi, in a famous case, had shot two young Black men. One of them had been killed. Harry Moore led a really vigorous, robust campaign to prosecute the sheriff. And again, it's just, I'm going to act like a citizen. That's absolutely crazy to think that this, but he's going to force the system to acknowledge him. Well, it did. So he and Harriet went to bed Christmas Eve, and sometime during the night, dynamite destroyed their bedroom. I think you can see that's the bedroom, sort of blown completely out of their house. The nearest Black hospital, Negro hospital at that time, was 30 miles away. By the time he got there, he was dead. his wife didn't die until like a week and a half later, and her friends thought it was a death of the spirit, right? That it was she didn't, that without him, and she said things pretty close to this, right? That she didn't see a purpose anymore, and it was like she gave up. But in any case, 9 days afterwards, after Harriet died. In those days, certainly in the 1930s and 40s, in the case of racial killings for the funeral, just nobody showed up, right? Typically because everybody was afraid to be seen going to the funeral of somebody who had been struck down by white supremacy. But one of the changes that we see in the late 40s and early 50s is that begins to change. So hundreds of people turned out for his funeral. And it's clearly, in that era, it's a form of protest, right? He was a person who stood for us, and in his death, we're going to stand for him, right? But again, that wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. In most of the South, that just would not have happened. But he stirred something in people, right? And he got them to step forward. Ella Baker, who is the activist, the teacher of activists, right? Said that for years after that, you could go in that part of Florida and you can mention the name of Harry T. Moore, and people would listen to you because they hadn't studied a whole lot of political theory, but they knew there was a man who represented their interest, right? And that's what Harry T. Moore, to some degree even now, right? For older folk in Central Florida, that's what the Moors represent. Final piece of irony on this story, right? Evangeline Moore, that's their daughter. In 1951, part of that first generation of young Black women who start going to Washington, D.C. when the jobs begin opening up for Black women, clerical jobs. Those are great jobs compared to, being in Miss Ann's kitchen somewhere. A whole generation, right, of talented young Black women going to D.C. for those federal jobs. She's one of them, right? That night, Christmas Eve, she's on the way home from Washington, D.C. She's actually on the train when the explosion happened. Had she left a day earlier, she would have been caught in the explosion herself. And so years later, she, as a grown woman, she's visiting the Civil Rights Museum, Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham. And there they have the names of all the civil rights martyrs, everybody who died in struggle is up on a wall there, right? And so she looks at the wall, and then she goes, her family's names are not there. She goes to the director and says, my family struggled and they were killed in 1951. Why aren't they there? And the museum's director says something to the effect, oh, your parents were killed before the civil rights movement began. That's why they're not there. Right? It says something about the fixity of that idea, that the civil rights movement had some fixed point, and it goes from the middle of the 50s to the middle of the 60s, right? That idea is so deeply ingrained in us that people can make some really bizarre choices, right? Based on what seems on what seems obvious to them. So I think I will say one thing. They are, I'm pretty sure, unless you're from Florida, right? You don't know the names of these folks, unless you're from South Mississippi, you didn't know the names of them. So both of them are much venerated now, right? Because there's been a kind of a movement in these places to restore the memories of local civil rights history. But obviously, they have been left out of the national memory. They're not a part of the national understanding of what the movement was. The other thing that I will say, and I'm going to say this really quickly, is that there's no doubt that Andy Young is right when he says it is women. Not all the time and not all over the South, but it's especially true for the parts of the movement that I've studied. It's especially true in the early 60s in the rural South during that most dangerous period. After the passage of the 64-65 Civil Rights Act, it begins to change. more men come into the movement, more middle class people come into the movement, right? But in that really tough, ugly period, from 59, 60 to 65 or so, it is overwhelmingly women, right? They are more likely to take civil rights workers in, to attend mass meetings, to attend voter registration classes, and to actually register, right? It is women who are at the head of this. And actually, when the men come back in, it's partly because the women tell them to, right? And 65 or 66, we have pretty decent records of women saying it's time for men to assert themselves again. All kinds of ambiguous feelings about that among you, I am sure, right? But we think that's what happens. But anyway, it is, and I'm just going to mention names. I'm not going to try to tell a story. Found Mrs. Hamer, but I do love this. If they kill me, if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom, because I am not backing off. In the same spirit, and just a wonderful exemplar of what I think of the African American humanistic tradition, Vicki Gray, who's from Hattiesburg and was a friend of the Damers. Power in the movement. Septima Clark, whose citizenship school trained tens of thousands of people to register to vote, but also to be community leaders, right? And so they, again, became a significant part of, this is a good quote, though. I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. She's, again, the teacher's teacher. And I put her and Ella Baker in very, very similar kinds of categories, right? It's Ella Baker who literally sort of calls together the meeting out of which Nick comes, right? But there's also Ella who says, look, y'all don't need to be like these, forget my language, these bourgeois organizations, right? They call themselves civil rights organizations, right? And she'd worked for all of them, right? She knew what she was talking about. You need to stay separate. You need to distrust hierarchy, right? You need to distrust the idea of people having power over other people, whether they're the same color or different colors, right? And you need to develop leadership in other folk. And that becomes kind of the ethos of, not just because she's not the only one. She's probably the most powerful voice saying that. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee becomes an organization that is trying to build organization as opposed to winning sort of tactical goals. And so women had an enormous impact on shaping the voter registration movement in the most dangerous places at the most dangerous times. That said, then my final question for you is, what does it mean that most of this history is not possessed by most Americans, right? We've all been raised on this notion of an ever-expanding American democracy. Well, this is probably the most dramatic recent example of the expansion of American democracy. We're now seeing the contraction of American democracy, as I said at the beginning, right? What does it mean that people do not know the folk who were at the fore, do not understand the folk who made the greatest sacrifices? What does it, and I can go through any state in the South and find you multiple people like these people. These are not exceptional people in that sense, right? What does it mean that they have been wiped out of our consciousness, right? What are the consequences of that? So anyway, I will stop there. And we still have time for questions, Christina?
Yes, does anyone have any questions?
Okay. Anyone have any questions? Or comments, or testimonials, or complaints? Or Christina takes the complaints. Go ahead.
What will you be teaching? I would love to teach.
I'm almost positive I'll be able to teach next spring. And I think it'll be a course, this course, the Civil Rights Movement. Yes, sir, in the back.
When we were talking about about how he was advocating for an organization that didn't have a hierarchy. And I was just interested, how do you have an organization without hierarchy?
One is not. This example doesn't work as well as it would have worked 2 years ago because John Lewis has gotten so much publicity in the last, since his death. But he's I think the second chairperson of SNCC. Marion Barry is first. He's the third chairperson of SNCC, right? Until the latter years of his life, most Americans did not know who he was, right? When he was the chairperson of SNCC, folk did not know who he was, right? Even though he spoke at the March on Washington on behalf of SNCC. That's a controversial story. Until Stokely Carmichael who brought a different ethos, right? A kind of, if you will, northern ethos, individualistic ethos. That's my own interpretation. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. The people who led SNCC were largely anonymous to the rest of the world. How many of you know Diane Nash? Yeah, ain't too bad. That's better than the average audience, right? So part of what this is, I'm going to send out some information. How many of you knew Bob Moses? Okay, I will circulate some information on Bob Moses conference. It's happening in a couple of weeks. These folk were powers in that movement, right? But they never became national names, national celebrities. One of Bob's strategies was, look, the way the media operates is that when it wants to cover a story, it's going to create leaders. And every time something happens, they're going to run right back to those same leaders and ask them to comment, right? We don't play that. When you run up here and ask me to comment, I'm going to tell you, go talk to Mrs. Hamer, right? I'm going to tell you, go talk to Mr. Damer. And they deflected media attention, right, as a matter of policy from the people with whom the media was comfortable, because the media doesn't have a category in which to put Mrs. Hamer. She's not their version of a leader. Well, we don't accept their right to tell us who our leaders are, right? So we throw up. We project the people we want to project, not the people they want. That's one part of it, right? The other part of it is, to this day, right, and now the folk in SNCC are late 70s and early 80s, but when they come together for a reunion, you can walk into any of their meetings and just shout out from the back of the room, who made that decision? And everybody just breaks up laughing, right? Because back in the day, they were very, very sensitive that everybody had a right to express their opinion on every issue of consequence. And what that meant was a culture in which you had participatory democracy. SNCC used that term before SDS used that term, right? So that means meetings, as they say, didn't go on for hours. They went on for days so that everybody could get their opinion out. It means that if you're one of the most respected folk in the meeting, or you could Jim Foreman or Bob Moses, you have so much personal charisma that when you speak in a meeting, it becomes an undemocratic thing, even if you don't want to, just because people respect you so much, right? So therefore, you don't speak. If you got something you want to say, and Bob did this to me once, and I could have killed him. Right? I worked with him on the algebra project. He had something he wanted to say to the meeting. He didn't want to say it, because again, he's Bob Moses. If he says it, it has a certain kind of power. So he got poor old Charlie Payne to go in front of that meeting and say, I forgot what it was, but it was stupid. And so everybody thinks it's my stupid idea. Right? And I get dumped, oh Lord. But that is, people had a variety of ways. You can't create flat organizations, right? But you can minimize, if you think about it, some of the effective organization. And maybe the most powerful thing is this. You can create cultures in which everybody thinks they have the right to lead, and everybody develops the skills of leaders, and then they cannot be manipulated because they know how the game is played, right? They know when somebody at the front of the room is trying to manipulate them because they have gone through that kind of leadership. One last comment on that, right? And this is a personal joke from me. There was a time at which Black student organizations on college campuses didn't have officers, no president, vice president, none of that treasurer, that stuff. They would have facilitators or coordinators, right? And I used to go around just teasing folks. How come y'all gotta be different, right? Negroes always gotta be different. Everybody else got president, you got facilitator. Why is that? And by the 1980s, that very few folk knew what it was. It was that in the late 1960s, when Black student organizations were being formed on white campuses, SNCC was still the dominant model, one of the dominant models of youth organization. And they adopted the anti-hierarchy, anti-bureaucracy ethos of SNCC, and they tried to use titles that sounded flatter, right? So anyway, that's a crucial question, right? Is how do we, Septima Clark would say, how do you become a part of the army of democracy, right? And how do you make democratic ethos a part of not what you do on election day, but what you do all the time? Every organization throbs with a democratic ethos. It's a crucial question, and one which I think is being lost. There's another question. Go ahead. Yes, please. In the group, yes.
I wanted to ask, how do you think we can cultivate that kind of leadership in our young people at a time when, as you said, so much of our moment is contracting this sort of education that empowers them to be active in the political process?
I think one of the things that I will ask Christina to send to all of you is, as soon as we get it written, which will be this week, we are trying to start here in Newark a movement around the idea of the freedom schools. You know, the freedom schools came out of Mississippi, SNCC 64, and in effect they were saying, if these schools do not serve our children, let us create schools that do serve our children until these schools straighten themselves out, right? So we're back to that, right? I mean, very clear when people are saying this whole CRT nonsense, right? So-called CRT nonsense, right? They're saying these are our schools and they can teach what makes our kids feel good, right? Your kids can go to hell, right? It is just so plain, right? There's a certain segment of the population that has an incredible sense of entitlement that leaves us out, right? And so suppose you then reverse it, right? What would schools look like if Black, brown, and students from other underserved communities, if their needs were the central issue in the school? They're not a peripheral issue or something you do during the month of February. It is the central issue in the school. How do you support these kids, right? We're trying to think about what does that look like well, I'm sorry. This is 20. I very often live in the past. That is true. What does that look like? What does that look like for our time? So, for me, that is one part of it. But and I'll also send you. I'll also send you some links to some of the discussions we've had with various people. But one of the ones I would especially like you guys to look at, and I'll chew this so you can just look at a 10-minute segment of it. Monica Hall, who grew up in the Youth Media Symposium. I don't know if you guys remember Junius Williams, who is a presence in this town, right? The official historian. He's actually a SNCC veteran in part and an SDS veteran. He has done lots of freedom school kinds of things, right? Which means at the center of education for a freedom school is that education is not simply an individual right. Education is about the individual's relationship to a community, and education is about the right to change. But when you see what these kinds of Youth Media Symposium trains high school students as journalists, which means they get to ask a certain kind of question that high school students very seldom get to ask and have experiences they seldom get to have. Those kinds of programs are very, very powerful. And I am entirely in favor of them and trying to promote more of them. That too is a really, really good question. But I will be sending some stuff back to you, Christina. Other questions? James, John?
I was really struck by the phrase that you used, a magnificent defiance, right? And how, these different families, different people across the South just really stood up and imagined, the idea that there could actually be an American democracy, right? So I think one of the things I'm particularly, I struggle with in class with a lot of my students is that, we see American democracy contracting, right? And so it's really, really hard to believe that something could be different, right? And so, I'm trying to often be an optimist in class. But I'm really curious, like in 1940s, what is the reason for optimism, right? There isn't there's just so many constraints. There's what allows them to imagine that, actually suing, that using what is this belief that something could actually change?
I'm going to say two things. And again, first I'm going to say I don't know, and I puzzle over that, right? Why is it that women are more? There's no reason from the viewpoint of the rural South in the early 1960s to think that a system which has been in existence since 1890 is going to change in your lifetime, right? There's nothing you can point to, right? Certainly the Kennedys, believe me. There is very little that you can point to that would give you hope, right? So where do people get hope? I think a lot of it just has to do with religious differences in the quality of religious belief by gender, right? Women are connected to God in a different way, right? And black women in the South, I probably don't have to say, I don't have to finish the sentence, do I? Once you stir them up and you ask them, as Mrs. Hamer would, do you think this is what God wants for you? Do you think this is what God wants for your children? If not, then, if you don't stand up, you don't really believe what you say about God. Right? And the boy, that was she gave 15 different versions of that. Right? And so I think it is that there is no rational reason to believe. You need an irrational basis for belief. Right? I think that's one part of it. The other thing, though, that I don't, and I recommend, for a lot of reasons, I recommend the film Freedom Song, which is about Southwest Mississippi, one of the most violent corners of the state, and how the movement starts off there. But it's really also, it's made by lots of civil rights folk. And it's really a commentary on the relationship between generations in the South and the fact that the younger generation thought the older generation had failed them, right? It starts with this scene where a group of racist white men make Danny Glover, the lead character, beat his son for no reason, right? And he's just completely humiliated, and the son just loses respect for him, right? And that's what the movie is really about. It's not really about the civil rights movement, right? It's about that torn relationship between the generations. And in the end, it comes back to say, what the young folk could not understand is that they had been imbued by their parents with a sense of their own worth. And once they got that sense of their own worth, the system was going to begin to crack, right? Because remember Diane Nash talking about, look, my grandmother had made it very, very clear to me that I was the single most important person in the world, right? And so I go to Nashville and some cracker says to me, I can't try on a pair of shoes. No, that doesn't make any sense. He doesn't understand. I am the most important person in the world, right? This idea, this sense of themselves, right? That their parents had given them in spite of growing up in a racist context, North or South, inevitably pushed the kids further and faster than their parents wanted, right? But even though they did not recognize it, their activism was rooted and was partly rooted in the heritage passed on to by their parents. And that's not an answer, but that's as close as I can come to sort of scratching it out. It's a heck of a question. John?
I think we're getting close to time.
Yeah.
So just two quick points. The first one is, what was the role? Because I know one of the things that I was asking you to read about, some of the young people, but some of the established figures, was there also the connection to leftist activism and organizing, which is kind of fascinating because that often just gets suppressed. And the second question is, you think about like the challenges not just in the South. I mean, clearly the South was a world of its own. But I'm thinking about like the pushbacks and the voter suppression, et cetera, all the limits were placed on Black people in the North, right? And I'm curious to know, just to give about some dialogue that happened in the past, and then in particular about dialogue that need to be happening now, that are happening.
In terms of
voter suppression, pushback against what we're seeing happen.
on the first leftist influence in the movement, I think it's actually pretty substantial. It's always complicated, right? Because the left is complicated, and left-wing liberalism, I'm going to call it, is very often connected to various kinds of paternalism. And that's the history of blacks in the Communist Party. You go into it real enthusiastic, and then you find these people have their own issues, right? Ella Baker, I think her youth is youth right out of college in New York in the maelstrom of the late 1920s, early 1930s. She's deeply affected by socialist thinking, right? I mean, she's clearly a socialist, and ran with communists in her day, right? So those influences, I think, are significant. One of the best quotes I've ever heard about Snitch is that someone said, "Wish to God there were communists in SNCC. They would be a moderating influence." Right? That to the side. And the question about contemporary dialogues is, where are they happening?
Yeah, where they are.
The Highlander Center, which I don't know now, it must be 80 years now, has been the source of radical and activist training in the center and in the South. That's certainly one place. I am most connected. Oh, there's a place that's sort of in the spirit of Ella Baker called Spadework. It's a group in San Francisco that's trying to train a generation of organizers in the spirit of Ella Baker. It's not the dramatic work; it's the slow work of growing folk. In education, I am really impressed. First of all, Children's Defense Fund, which we've been working pretty closely lately, is evolving. They've got a whole new generation of young, energetic folk, and they're going to become a force to reckon with. There's a group run by a man who is both of his parents, Sharif El-Mekki, both of his parents were Black Panthers in Philadelphia back in the day. He has taken on as his life's work creating a new generation of activist Black educators in the Philadelphia area, and that work is I think fascinating. So those are the places off the top of my head that I would think of, with some great conversations going on. Okay.
And with that, I think we'll end this meeting. Very good. Thank you for coming out. And please look online for the calendar of events this week. Lots of great stuff happening.
Thank you so much.
Thank all of you. I enjoyed it.